Thank you very much, everyone, for coming, and thanks to Fraser for inviting me and all the organisers of the event. So I'm going to, many of the examples in my talk looking at compassion are focused on nursing, because that's my area of research. But I think some of them may raise questions about the idea of compassion in a wider context, and some of them are quite specific to nursing as well. So it also raises questions of how particular emotions are understood differently in different contexts. Why do you wish to become a nurse? Jean Stone remembers the matron asking her when she started her studies at the Radcliffe Infirmary in Oxford in 1943. And she reflected back on this later in some notes about her experiences of training. What a strange question, I thought. Only later did I appreciate that she was looking for essential aptitudes of understanding, compassion, kindness, and common sense, in addition to nursing skills to be gained from those senior to me who taught by example on the ward. And it's not uncommon among autobiographical accounts of nursing to find these references to the sorts of emotions that are expected in nursing experience. This is something that matrons or nursing tutors tend to raise in the very first lecture from in late 19th century nursing schools through to the mid-20th century, list all of these traits important to nursing, including such things as compassion and sympathy. And then these are almost never referred to again through the training, and also very rarely within the autobiographical accounts, which mostly focus on practical and clinical skills. So there's this sense that this is a kind of unspoken but essential element of nursing, that may be an individual trait that people bring to nursing, or something that's somehow cultivated through experience without really being explained why, and often only is highlighted through both celebrations of good experiences, such as the certificate you can see here for Nurse Mallins, who was given this certificate in appreciation and gratitude for her unfailing cheerfulness, sympathy and skill, but also in examples of what are seen as failings of care as well, where a lack of compassion, especially if we think of modern examples like the Francis report, the supposed lack of compassion on the part of nurses was something picked up in the media. So I'm largely going to look at the earlier history of this in my talk today. So this is what I'm going to focus on, starting with a little bit of general context about what's meant by compassion. And then I'm going to focus largely on the late 19th and early 20th century, which was a time of considerable change within the nursing profession, but also for understandings of compassion and sympathy more widely. So I'm going to look first at the ways in which compassion was understood in gendered terms in the late Victorian period, and then how this was attached to the idea of nursing in the same period and into the 20th century. And then just end with a few reflections and questions about what that means for nursing and compassion today. So, first of all, what do we mean by compassion? Well, according to a quick search on Google Images, compassion is best summed up by an otter being handed a heart. But if we look at the meaning of the term and the roots of the term, so the Latin roots of compassion mean to suffer together, which is the same as the term sympathy, coming from the Greek, also means to suffer together. But in definitions today, such as that in the Oxford English Dictionary, there's generally raised a link between an emotion and an action. So the idea that compassion is a feeling or emotion when a person is moved by the suffering or distress of another and by the desire to relieve it. So compassion itself is these two linked things, and this is very often how it's understood in a nursing context. As Rob Boddice has put it in his history of sympathy, these ideas become a vehicle for translating the emotions of others rather than an emotion itself. So it's often about the way in which compassion or sympathy is expressed and viewed by other people, as well as an internal feeling. Of course, I've already used two terms, compassion and sympathy, and the terms that we use for such traits have altered over time. So this chart shows the use of different terms, although of course it doesn't tell us anything about the way in which terms were used, through English texts from 1700 to 2000. So just before this chart begins, from the 14th to the 17th century, Carolyn Pedwell, in her work on the politics of empathy, has indicated that compassion was a widely used term to show fellow feeling, but often among people in the same sorts of situations. But as we get into the 18th century, the use of the term sympathy, often to mean a similar sort of fellow feeling, gradually increases. And from the early 19th century, sympathy came to be a very, very widely used term, and especially in the second half of the 19th century. And then you can see as the 20th century progresses, new terms coming in, like empathy. And then another new term in the 19th century, which is not really used enough to show on the chart, which is altruism. But if you want to read more about that, then Thomas Dixon's work on the invention of altruism shows how this comes in as a secular kind of emotion. Because I'm looking at the late 19th century, the term that's very often used rather than compassion is sympathy. And interestingly, it's used in a similar way to how compassion had previously been used in nursing beforehand. So historians of nursing like Erin Spinney have looked at 17th and 18th century nursing, and compassion is seen as a trait that's important in nursing then. But that word is not really used in this time period, but sympathy is used in a similar way. And there are two things that I want to put forward about the way in which sympathy was being newly characterised in the last 3 decades of the 19th century. So first of all, it was being, this idea of fellow feeling was newly characterised in evolutionary terms. So from the publication of Charles Darwin's The Descent of Man in 1871, Darwin raised the social instincts as being important to the development of mankind and society. And for him, the foundation stone, as he put it, of these social instincts was sympathy. As he put it in the text, the social instincts, which no doubt were acquired by man, as by the lower animals for the good of the community, will from the first have given to him some wish to aid his fellows, some feeling of sympathy, and have compelled him to regard their approbation and disapprobation. So moving on from this, Darwin and a number of those who took up his theories began to explain society within these evolutionary terms. So there was this idea that sympathy led to a progression of society from what Darwin and anthropologists of the period saw as primitive societies in which sympathy was largely extended to the immediate family, to those in which it extended out to a wider community or tribe, to the peak, as they saw it, them and their friends in Western civilization, who had somehow acquired a sympathy for the entirety of humanity and for animals often as well. And Rob Bodis's text on the science of sympathy has looked at the way this notion of sympathy as encompassing all of humanity was used to support and explain such things as vivisection, compulsory vaccination, and eugenics. So this notion of sympathy as being heavily linked to social values in the late 19th century, the view of sympathy as essential for the development of mankind was also used to support contemporary Western values and social structures. And people like Herbert Spencer emphasised the way in which particular elements of Western civilization, as he thought, promoted the ideals of sympathy. He claimed that the races that have become most sympathetic are those in which monogamy has been long established, those in which the cooperation of parents for rearing children is continued to a comparatively late period in the lives of children, and a number of other examples that he gave. When, of course, if we look at it from a different perspective, there's no obvious reason as to why a monogamous relationship should lead to a wider development of sympathy, because this is actually focusing inwards on the family, which had been seen as the kind of earliest stage of sympathy rather than focusing outwards. But for Spencer and many others of the time, this was the case. But I picked out these particular elements of a long list of aspects of Western civilization that Spencer felt promoted sympathy, because very often this began with concepts of family and motherhood. So let's talk about gender. So there were two sides to sympathy in relation to gender in this period. So first of all, there was the notion that sympathy was a naturally female trait. And Darwin certainly suggested this in The Descent of Man, that woman seems to differ from man in mental disposition, chiefly in her greater tenderness and less selfishness. Woman, owing to her maternal instincts, displays these qualities towards her infants in an eminent degree. Therefore, it is likely that she would often extend them toward her fellow creatures. So there's this assumption there's a natural trait in women towards sympathy that was kind of automatically developed. But then on the flip side of this, we get this sense promoted particularly by people like Herbert Spencer that therefore sympathy could only become more highly developed in men than in women. So Spencer gives the example of a woman jumping into a river to save her own child, whereas the example for a man is jumping into a river to save a stranger's child. So this focus for women is supposedly very inward towards the family, to the immediate circle, whereas men who would develop this higher kind of sympathy that encompassed all of humanity. And you can really see this in Rob Boddis's work on vivisection. And he looks at the way the term compassion, as well as sympathy, was picked up by scientists to explain their relationship to vivisection on animals, with this idea that compassion was actually an emotion that they could set aside the immediate suffering of the animal on which they were experimenting because of their sympathy for humanity. So there's actually a kind of distancing element of that kind of manly compassion in this period that you don't see in notions of compassion in women, or sympathy in women. So female sympathy was very much characterised as being domestic. It was part of this Victorian domestic ideal. So women managed the home, both practically and emotionally, whereas men managed social affairs outside the home. And as Joseph Johnson put it in his book, Earnest Women, he linked the ideas of sympathy and service. So sympathy and service is the province of women, and this is a very domesticised view. She turns as naturally to sorrow and suffering as the sunflower to the sun. If she cannot aid by her hand, she gives the sympathy of her heart. And this was in the introduction to the part of his book that celebrated the care given by nurses such as Florence Nightingale, seeing this as an extension of women's domestic role. This was a kind of very understated, everyday sort of sympathy, unlike the heroic male rescuing of strangers. This painting on the right-hand side is George Frederick Watts's painting entitled Sympathy, and it's quite an it shows quite an not as highly sentimentalised as many of his other works. It's this quite everyday bourgeois depiction of sympathy as a female ideal. And one example that I want to give of this female version of sympathy, which also encompasses terms like self-sacrifice, is that of a short story called Lizzie Blake, or Self-Sacrifice. Now this was published in 1882 by the London Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge, and it tells the tale of a young girl named Lizzie Blake, who's 12 years old at the start of the story. Now, unfortunately, early on in the story, Lizzie's mother dies. She has a large family, a large number of siblings. Her father struggles to support them and makes himself ill through overwork. So Lizzie and her sister Martha are expected to take care of the family as the older children. However, Martha, selfishly, as the term is used about her in the text, decides to gain what's referred to as independence as a servant and leaves the family home to go and work. Lizzie, however, a slightly younger child, had dreams of becoming a pupil teacher, something that her school teacher tried to encourage her towards as an intelligent young girl. But Lizzie gives up her dream and does the right thing by going home and looking after her father, nursing him back to health and caring for her younger siblings. The text ends with this very moralising statement that I hope the girls who read this will try and be like Lizzie, who in all she did was so unselfish and kind. There is no doubt if all tried to give up their own will and to think of others before their own pleasure, the homes of a great many would be the happier for it. Now, there's no doubt in this text that the all referred to is all women. The only named characters in the story are the selfish Martha and the self-sacrificing Lizzie. The expectation is that the first duty of women and girls, both working class and middle class women, is towards the family and the home. And this was quite a tension, really, in the early potential tension in the development of nursing as a working role for women. Because in this case, these ideas of these natural female traits, this domestic element of women's work, of women's role, was applied to work. So I'm going to go on and talk about a couple of aspects of the development of the nursing profession in this period, because many nursing advocates use these ideas of kind of womanly sympathy and women's natural role in caring to justify extending this role beyond the home. So first of all, we get very much get this sense of the gendered ideal promoted within nursing, both the sense that women make better nurses, and also that nurses make women better women, or nursing makes women better women. So you can see this on the left-hand side in the words of Dr. James Crichton Brown in the, speaking to a select committee on the topic of nursing registration in 1904. And he set out the idea that nursing was actually a preparation for being a woman in a way. It's a preparation for motherhood. I have a strong view that every girl, as part of her school training, should have some little instruction in nursing. We are advocating the teaching of hygiene in schools, and I think a little training in nursing in the school would make the girl a better wife and mother. So there's this sense that many women would go into nursing, would not necessarily remain in the profession, but when they married and followed their true calling, they would be all the better for it. And then on the other side, there is this sense that anyone who fails to show the right type of emotions within nursing is actually failing much more generally as well. So in Eva Lux, the matron of St Thomas's Hospital, in her lectures on general nursing, first given in 1884, but she continued to give these lectures for a number of years after that. As she put it, referring to the sympathy that was expected to be expressed, if you fail in these little ways, it does prove that you are lacking in true womanly pity and tenderness, and that you are so far unfitted for your post. So a bad nurse was also a bad woman. And then there are two conflicts in nursing at this time, which I think bring this into a much broader perspective. And much of this focuses around the topic of state registration of nurses. So the first conflict is this idea of nursing as a vocation or calling versus the idea of nursing as a profession. So on the one side here, we have Florence Nightingale, both the way in which she presented nursing herself, but also the way in which she was represented by others as this kind of lady with the lamp pursuing her true calling as a religious woman to carry out nursing care. And this emphasised the notion that those who went into nursing were those who had particular traits, so those who had this calling, those who had this advanced state of sympathy and wanted to care for others. But then on the other side, we have many arguments about nursing being a scientific profession. And that was represented particularly by Ethel Gordon-Fenwick, who you can see in the centre of the image of on the right. And this is actually in leading a deputation of nurses on a suffrage march in 1909. So Fenwick, who campaigned for state registration of nurses from the 1880s right up until it was introduced in 1919, very much saw nursing as a scientific practice and emphasised that this was work for women and not simply a calling. However, like Nightingale, Fenwick and her followers did very much agree that character was an important element of it and that women made better nurses because they had this sympathetic character. The other element that came into both of this was the discussion as to whether sympathy was natural in women or as to whether sympathy was something refined in women, as Spencer and Darwin and others had claimed it was in men. And this very much played out in notions of class around nursing at this time. So the image that you can see here is from the British Journal of Nursing in 1888, and it presents the supposed changes in nursing over the last 50 years. From on the left-hand side, the supposedly fat, slovenly, drunken nurse as represented by Dickens' Sarah Gamp. And then on the right-hand side, we have this modern, clean, young, and more middle-class Nightingale nurse. And class was very much emphasised by most of those in the debates around nursing, particularly Ethel Gordon-Fenwick, who felt that by turning nursing into a scientific profession, it would be raising the status of the profession, encouraging more ladies and middle-class women to go into the profession, and that their character, which she assumed would be more refined and sympathetic, would improve the nature of nursing. And indeed, Florence Nightingale claimed similarly, but she felt that there needed to be a wider mix of nurses, but that all the nursing leaders should be ladies like herself, because again, that would, as she put it, improve the nature of the profession. So when you get emotions mentioned in nursing adverts, as this one in the middle from the Nursing Times in 1906, I think, the emotions tend to come up associated with gentlewomen, such as this one, not in adverts for general nurses. So in this case, this gentlewoman seeking situation as a companion nurse emphasises that she is of sympathetic nature and loves children and animals. So this sympathy is seen as a refined trait. Where next? I'm about 6 months into this research, so hoping to take it much further into the 20th century and look at how the term compassion has changed in nursing in that time. And I think one interesting aspect of this is the way in which both the ideas of emotions and the class-based elements we've seen earlier end up presented in the image of the nurse. So in 1939, the Nursing Mirror held an interesting competition to try and uncover the typical nurse, as they called it. And here are 5 of the many images of typical nurses that they published from it. And in the guidelines for the competition, they emphasise that this is not a beauty competition in the ordinary sense of the word. It is to find the typical nurse, the nurse whose features suggest not merely beauty of line, but professional capacity and human sympathy. So there's this idea that one can immediately view this idea of sympathy or compassion by looking at a nurse. And we need to unpick, I think, how this was expected to be expressed. There's strong similarity to this idea in 1888 in the British Journal of Nursing that you can view simply by looking at these images as the who is the better nurse. And again, this is coming up in the 1930s. But these traits remain very ill-defined, but expected and assumed that they're obvious and visible. And I think this continues to be the case today, that the term compassion is often invoked, especially around failures of care, but it remains ill-defined. It may not always be recognised or taught in the same way that other skills are. There's still this idea that certain types of people or the right people should be going into nursing, and raises a huge number of questions as well that are very rarely answered. Is compassion something that's within the individual, or is it about the way the society sees them, the way we present care, the actions that we give? Is it something that the institution needs to participate in? Is it something that people come to nursing with, or something that they should be taught? And how does the way that we express it change over time? And I think we need a historical perspective on ideas like compassion in order to try and start answering those questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Wow. Fascinating talk. Thank you.